2001, Bachelor's of Science in Chemistry and Mathematics with highest honors from the University of Florida. And then a mere 2 years later, in 2003, an MTS in Liturgical Theology from Notre Dame. And followed by her Ph.D. in 2008, also with high honors. From an undergraduate degree with a double major in chemistry and math to graduate work in liturgical studies, I thought, I think there's a story there. The details of which I heard about in a Zoom meeting a few weeks ago. The narrative begins when Kim was quite ready, and her parents were sure about this, quite ready to start kindergarten, even though with her mid-October birthday, she was only 4 years old, a few weeks of turning 5. The public schools, however, had a very firm must be 5 years old by September 1st cutoff date. Not so the local non-denominational evangelical Christian school. So even though in Kim's words, she grew up in a non-practicing home, her parents chose to send her to this Christian school, where she said, they played hymns over the PA system. And one of her favorites was, "Take my life and let it be." You can sing along with me. Take my life and let it be consecrated, Lord, to thee. Take my moments and my days, let them flow in ceaseless praise. The precocious Kim soon learned that her classmates were all attending church and Sunday school. I told my parents, everybody at my school goes to church on Sunday, and I need to do that too. The family chose the Presbyterian Church USA, and by the time she was 10 or 11, Kim announced to her parents, I want to be baptized. And so she was. Sadly, after a major conflict in the congregation, her parents stopped attending. But Kim recounts, when I was 13 and had more agency, I started going to a bunch of different churches. As a senior in high school, she joined a Methodist congregation. At the University of Florida, she soon got connected with the Newman Center on campus, where, she said, I met a bunch of deeply Vatican II formed, liturgically movement formed, ecumenically oriented Catholic liturgical ministers. And that was it, she said. She was drawn in by the Eucharistic theology of Christ's presence in the meal, which, she said, gave language to things that made sense to me from my own experience. So I joined the Catholic Church at age 19. Although she went on to complete her double major in math and chemistry, while also reading theology on the side, she immediately sought out graduate work in theology. And so, in spite of not having the prerequisite 9 credits of theology or philosophy, Kim applied to Notre Dame and was surprised to be admitted. When she later asked the MTS director, "Why did you do this?" he said, "We were curious." And Nathan Mitchell, advisor for her dissertation, told her, "We decided if we didn't let you in, we would never figure out why you wanted to do it." And so began her path in theological academia, and perhaps sown from the seeds of stanza 4 of Take My Life. Join with me. Take my silver and my gold, not a mite would I withhold. Take my intellect and use every power as thou shalt choose. Kim brings to our 2026 ILS gathering her vast scholarly work in ritual studies, in sacramental theology, in theories of trauma, reconciliation, and healing. But of greater importance in this context is her deep commitment to ecumenism, a commitment that has been part of her very being since, as a 13-year-old, she was out church shopping, visiting congregations, and simultaneously developing, and here I quote again, a really deep respect for all of these Christians in all their different ways of practicing Christianity, of loving Jesus, of following Jesus. The welcome by the Newman Center staff for this young Methodist woman was transformative. Of them, Kim said, they were ecumenically oriented toward my life in a way that gave me a language for this passion I had for the unity of the churches. A passion, as she shared with me, that found its way into her dreams, not her daydreams. No, Kim clarified, I actually had dreams when I was about 13 or 14, literally dreams at night, dreams about church unity and disunity. We see that passion in the title of today's address, a feast celebrating the mystery of creation, an ecumenical dream. Please join me in welcoming Kim Belcher.
I told Rhoda, I think this is the loveliest introduction I have ever heard in my whole history of attending academic conferences, and I just wanted to be there forever. But unfortunately, you now have to listen to me. It's a real privilege to be here. I was here with you last year. You are a lovely audience. I love this conference so much. So fond of so many of you. So I'm really privileged to be here. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about the Feast of Creation, and I think my task is, on the one hand, to introduce what is the Feast of Creation and what's going on with it in all of its ecumenical variety right now, which honestly, as it's still developing, and I am not a news anchor, although I did at one point want to be a journalist before the chemistry piece. I have to tell you, I can give you, sort of an update as of a few weeks ago, but this is still developing. And then I also want to think about what are the gifts that this feast, as it's developing, offers to us, and particularly because of my interest in ecumenism, I'm interested in the ways it's teaching us to work together in a way that's different, and kind of what is it that liturgical celebration, and especially the development of a new calendrical rite together, offers to our work for Christian unity. So first, just very briefly, to give you a kind of general background, in 2024 and 2025, there were several conferences held. Several of them were in Assisi, some of them were in other parts of the world, to refine the idea of adopting a Feast of Creation on September 1st, or possibly the Sunday after September 1st, or there were also advocates for doing it on the fall equinox, and to create ecumenical consensus on its theological meaning. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on that later. The goal of the organizers of these conferences was to promote an official feast at the global and ecumenical level to be held for the first time in fall 2025 in order to commemorate the 1700th anniversary of the Council of Nicaea. The Feast of Creation then would not only respond to the ecological crisis, but also celebrate the lines of the Nicene-Constantinopolitan Creed that read, "Maker of heaven and earth, of all things visible and invisible, and through whom all things were made." So my reflections here will be on the importance of this work for the ecumenical movement. But I'm a little worried that when we think about creatures, we think too universally. And I'm also a little worried that when we think about Christianity, we think a little too universally. And so I'm going to start with creatures. So I want to start with, first of all, the most basic idea of creation, or the creatures, which I think we can use to kind of suggest a false idea of universality. And I want to start us off by thinking in terms of particularity, so we can kind of get into that habit. So that's a strong point of eco-theology and integrated ecology, but I also want to draw on my experience of being in Assisi for the two conferences in December 2024 and May 2025 to think about Francis's Canticle of the Creatures. So the first stanza reads, "Most high, all-powerful, all-good Lord, all praise is yours, all glory, all honor, and all blessing. All praise be yours, my Lord, through all that you have made." I almost feel like I could write this stanza myself from this terrace outside St. Clare's Basilica in Assisi. And I took this photo when I was there in December 2024. And for that conference, I actually took my then 11-year-old daughter with me. And she loves Italy and loves Assisi. So when I look at these pictures, I look not only at Assisi, at the creatures outside Assisi, but also in a way through the lens of my child and her wonder at creation. So here's another example. Here, from one of the footpath stone streets of Assisi, we can see the morning glance of Brother Sun who brings the day. It would be really difficult to find a comparable view within a few hundred miles of this place where we currently are. And then here, from the front of the Upper Basilica of St. Francis, we can see the eyes of sister moon and stars, bright and precious and fair. And it's not, of course, that we cannot see and praise the sun and the moon and the stars and all these other creatures from wherever we happen to be. But I find it helpful to recall that Francis of Assisi had a very specific love affair with creation, and it was born in this very specific rocky, hilly, wild, and olive-strewn place. The next, one of the later stanzas reads, "All praise be yours, my Lord, through brothers wind and air, and fair and stormy, all the weather's moods, by which you cherish all that you have made." And this line actually reminds me of our immortal Midwestern joke, "You don't like the weather in Indiana, wait 5 minutes," which we actually lived together last night, and I was very amused. But the fair and the stormy of Assisi has an unusual drama. This is a morning photo from outside the place where the Feast of Creation conference was held. This is 4 p.m. on December 7th, 2024. That's the sun. It's sunny. This is 4:47 p.m. on the same day in Assisi on December 7th, 2024. This is 4:51 p.m. A little bit actually like my academic trajectory, maybe. If I had taken a photo 5 minutes later, it would have just looked like a dark, foggy night. That's how fast the fog came in, and I was too busy scurrying back to the conference venue with Hilda to take a photo for you of the dark fog with random lights showing through it. So, somehow these photos give me a more profound sense of what's at stake when St. Francis develops a theology of a passionate, loving, and unexpected God who can be seen in God's creatures, as well as some insight into the vision that launched the Franciscan movement and continues to inspire us 800 years later. But, I forgot about this. These are more creatures in Assisi. But we're not there. We're here. There are less dramatic basilicas and dramatic hills and stone streets, and more creatures that seem to us common and mundane. Here are Brother Sun and Sister Moon showing their faces at Indiana Dunes, which is a really lovely, thank you, Flickr. And here, during the North American Academy of Liturgy here in Valpo in January 2025, my friend Carl Baer, I'm sure many of you know, began a Canticle of the Creatures that drew attention to and convoked the genuinely local creatures of this place to sing praise. So I'll read it. I'm not a song leader, I'm afraid, but all you creatures of God, pray with us. Sugar maple, pray with us. Red-tailed hawk, pray with us. Mourning dove, or eastern gray squirrel, pray with us. Mourning dove, pray with us. Tulip tree, pray with us. Eastern red cedar, pray with us. Staghorn sumac, pray with us. Carl commented in his email to me, I drew the plants and animals from iNaturalist. They were the most recently recorded observations from the area that approximately corresponds to Valpo's campus. Such a lovely mode of prayer. Carl has been on some itinerant liturgical peregrinations since then, and in a truly Franciscan spirit, he has developed a bunch of variations of this litany for specific locations, and I think I really love this project because I think it could be adapted to any location and really immerse us into the specifics of the places we're called to love, just as Francis loved the place that he lived. There's also another two things that I find helpful for understanding ecumenism and the ecumenical feast about this sort of comparison to begin between Francis's creatures and Carl's creatures. The first is that although the value of creation does not depend on our recognition of it or its use to us, nonetheless, human beings registering creatures in iNaturalist and convoking them in canticles and litanies are, in Aidan Kavanaugh's famous words, doing the world as the world is meant to be done. This doing, the incorporation of the earthly into the heavenly liturgy, demands we not romanticize the there. Reverence for creation that touches Assisi but not Valpo, or the sun but not the mosquitoes, will not convert us. So that's why I have this section of, it's a very lengthy litany, this section that begins, all you mosquitoes, pray for us, pray with us, all you bees and wasps. I don't know, do we want the mosquitoes to pray with us? If not, we might need conversion. The second point I think that's important about this is that universality arises out of particularity. And it doesn't come about by glossing over difference, but by uplifting it into a richness that does justice to the diversity of our experience. In other words, I moved that. Just pretend you didn't see that. In other words, number one, ecumenism and also this feast are about the intersection of what God has done and what human beings are doing to partake in that work. And number two, diverse experience, while it's a challenge to our presuppositions, is the friend of our unity and not its enemy. Let me talk about an ecumenical dream. Rhoda mentioned I have had ecumenical dreams since my early teens. In my waking experience of the church at that time, I became aware of how our presuppositions about Christians from other denominations get in the way of hearing one another and thus opening our minds and hearts to a fuller knowledge of God, who always transcends what we know. So if we refuse to know one another, we're refusing to know God as deeply as we're called to know God. My nighttime dreams, responding to this, were a little apocalyptic, and they imbued me with an enduring sense that this work is urgent as well as necessary. So for this reason, although there are a lot of people who are primarily invested in the Feast of Creation because of its potential to transform the human attitude towards non-human creatures, and that matters to me also, I am primarily invested in the Feast of Creation because of its ecumenical potential for getting us to listen to one another. In fact, at the ecumenical gathering in May 2025, I admitted over risotto that I would likely have given an equally enthusiastic yes to the ask if I was asked to develop an ecumenical feast on dentistry. Now, I didn't know I was going to say that before I said it, but it's true. So I first want to talk about ecumenism before I tell you more about the feast. Ecumenism is grounded for me in Jesus Christ's high priestly prayer in John 17. I ask not only on behalf of these, but also on behalf of those who believe in me through their word, that they may all be one. As you, Father, are in me and I am in you, may they also be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. The glory that you have given me, I have given them, so that they may be one as we are one, I in them and you in me, that they may become completely one, so that the world may know that you have sent me and have loved them even as you loved me. This is where I start when I'm teaching ecumenism, especially in my seminary and introductory level classes, because many people have thought of ecumenism as if it's just being nice. And this is not about being nice. There's two basic logics here that are fundamental to Christian identity that mandate us to work for unity with other Christians. First of all, our unity makes the evangelical mission of the church more compelling, that the world may know that you have sent me. And second, but even more importantly, it is a participation in the divine unity of love, so that they may be one as we are one. And because we always have a temptation to ask in these conditions, but who is my neighbor? That is, but who do I have to seek unity with? I always try to remember with this passage also John 10:16. I have other sheep that do not belong to this fold. I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice. So there will be one flock, one shepherd. It is the risen Lord, not us, that knows whom he has called. The extent of the flock becomes clear only on the arrival of the kingdom, that is, once and for all in the life, death, resurrection, ascension of Christ, and the sending of the Spirit, yet also visibly only on the day of the Lord. When the kingdom comes, Christian unity will be perfected. Precisely for this reason, we are called to make that unity ever more visible here and now. I think of this on analogy with a pilgrimage. In some way, we know where we are going, and we are following in the path of many people who have gone before us, and at the same time, we don't know how to get there. So, what does it mean to know where we're going? In Christian history, receiving from the Lord's table together has generally been taken to be the fullest sacramental sign and means of our eschatological unity. Christian communion has never been perfect, which is why I'm not using the shorthand here that intercommunion or communion at the table is ecumenical unity. It's never been perfect, and its cracks have always been visible at the table, as we know from the memorable scolding that Paul gives the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians. Nonetheless, the koinonia of Christians has always been real and imperfect, as it still is today. In the ancient world, most Christians did not travel widely, so ecumenical communion was not realized by, as we might envision today, the ability of ordinary Christians to go to a different local church and receive communion. Bishops, rather, exchanged letters and visited one another as proxies for individual Christians. They thus became the embodied, but still imperfect, sign of church unity. Every time I say this, I think of the long history of bishops jockeying for personal recognition at the expense of church unity. The mutual recognition of ministers, similarly today, provides the pastoral manifestation of our communion with one another, which of course continues to be imperfect. If communion in the Lord's Supper is the fullest sacramental sign, shared calendrical structures have also played a really important role in unifying the Christian church through the ages. There has always been, too, in calendrical structures, a certain unity and diversity involved. Local feasts express a sense of place, while shared calendrical practices unite the church. This was, of course, the motivation for setting a common date for Easter at the First Council of Nicaea, as well as, a favorite of mine, at the Synod of Whitby in 664. We're allowed to have our favorites. The uneven adoption of calendrical reforms intended to synchronize the human calendar with the solar year gradually separated Western and Eastern dates for Easter. The result is a loss of the ability to celebrate together the central feast of the Christian faith as a global Christian imperfect communion. Where we are today ecumenically is really unique in Christian history. We have Christians that are seeking unity with one another and others that are more interested in breaking communion with one another, and those people coexist in every church. And right now, with a desire for Christian unity, there does not appear to be a clear path towards an institutional unity that would be just and life-giving for the church as a whole. I always have to repeat that because I'm a Roman Catholic theologian, and no, I don't think everything would be solved if everybody was just, let's take on what the Pope says. So I'm going to say it again. There does not appear right now to be a clear path towards institutional unity that would be just and life-giving for the church as a whole. In particular, communion in the Lord's Supper and the recognition of one another's ministers are very challenging for Christian unity today. In these circumstances, other kinds of communal prayer and worship work together, and the cultivation of mutual love are necessary practices to walk in the calling to unity that Christ gave us. So, what kind of tool for unity is the Feast of Creation? I'll give a little historical and theological introduction, and I'll be using for much of this, the slides that were developed by the team guiding the Assisi process. So courtesy of Tomas Insua, who sent them to me. So really appreciate that. So let's talk about the development of the Feast of Creation. The Feast of Creation has several different motivations, which are operative in different parts of the universal church. On the one hand, the Byzantine church has long celebrated a feast called Indiction on September 1st. Considered the church's new year, it commemorates the beginning of God's creation in Genesis 1, the beginning of Christ's ministry in his reading of Isaiah in the synagogue at Nazareth in Luke 4, and the beginning of the secular, agricultural, and imperial year. It is also loosely associated with the Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah, which also commemorates the creation of the universe and occurs in the early fall. Here's one of the prayers that the Orthodox use for that feast. This one is from Orthros, or morning prayer. O Word of the Father from before the ages, who, being in the form of God, broughtest creation into being out of nothing, thou who hast put the times and seasons in thine own power, bless the crown of the year with thy goodness. Give peace unto thy churches, victory unto thy faithful hierarchs, fruitfulness unto the earth, and great mercy unto us. We can see in this prayer the unity of the creation by the word in the beginning of time, with the emphasis on the agricultural season and the ongoing bounty of the created order. In 1989, perceiving the ecological crisis, the ecumenical patriarch Demetrios expanded the emphasis on the act of creation in the Indiction Feast and invited the other Christian churches to adopt September 1st as a day to give thanks and pray for creation. In 1990, he commissioned a liturgical service for creation. Patriarch Bartholomew succeeded Demetrios in 1991, and I quote, "A month after his election in 1991, Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew convened an ecological gathering in Crete entitled Living in the Creation of the Lord. That convention was opened by Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, and then international chairman of the World Wildlife Fund. In the following year, Patriarch Bartholomew called an unprecedented meeting of all Orthodox patriarchs and primates at the Phanar, submitting an historical expression of unity by inviting all Orthodox leaders to inform their churches about the critical significance of this issue for our times. The primates endorsed September 1st as a day of pan-Orthodox prayer for the environment." I think it's interesting, it goes on later on in this same article by John Chrysovigus, to think about the scriptural passages that found Patriarch Bartholomew's commitment to the ecological movement. These include, quote, "From the book of Genesis, the creation of the world by the loving Creator, Genesis 1, the divine command to serve and preserve creation, Genesis 2, and the covenant struck between God and Noah on behalf of creation, Genesis 9. Additionally, there are the warnings about using and not abusing creation found in Ezekiel 34, as well as the Lord's teachings contained in the Beatitudes in Matthew 5 and the Transfiguration on Mount Tabor in Mark 9. In addition to the Orthodox, Patriarch Bartholomew from the beginning sought ecumenical and international partnerships in creation care. Although Roman Catholic pontiffs and other global church leaders have consistently been part of this endeavor, Pope Francis and Archbishop of Canterbury Rowan Williams were notable for their involvement. Francis's encyclical Laudato Si, promulgated in 2015, and Rowan Williams' book, Christ, the Heart of Creation, published in 2018, really amplified this movement. The World Council of Churches, meanwhile, established a season of creation to promote healed relationships with the created order starting in 2002, and that creation season began on September 1st. It continues to run from September 1st to October 4th every year. Like the Week of Prayer for Christian Unity, it has a unique theme and liturgical resources for each year. But what's different between them and a feast day is that these resources can be optionally adopted by churches in addition to their regular liturgical celebrations, while the Feast of Creation would be an enduring part of the liturgical calendar for churches that are participating. The first Assisi consultation in March 2024 included the World Council of Churches, several mainline Protestant international bodies, representation from Catholic research institutes, and the Orthodox. And already there was evidence, very interesting evidence, of some very different approaches to the question of how and why one might institute a new feast. We've never really tried to do this before. We have numerous instances, from the early period to the present, of one church or multiple churches adopting a feast that's already being celebrated by one church, and that's partly what's happening here, in that other churches are adopting the Orthodox feast. But we're really not adopting the Orthodox Feast of Indiction. We're really developing a whole new consensus ecumenically about what it might mean to and why we might want to celebrate the Feast of Creation. It's very exciting ecumenically, and it's extremely difficult. So what we see in the current theological treatment and emerging liturgical resources, which I'll get to the theological treatment, the Revised Common Lectionary text will be released in a couple weeks, so I'm not going to do the liturgical resources yet. What we see with these reflects an ecumenical respect for different challenges that the churches see among their members in the signs of the times, which I find to be uniquely compelling and much more valuable than one tradition having the right answer or a jump start on the problem of ecology today. Okay, so how new is it? Here's a little comparison, a case study, if you will, on the Revised Common Lectionary and the Feast of Christ the King or Reign of God, which is another ecumenically shared feast that's relatively modern. So the adoption of common Western lectionary traditions during the liturgical reforms of the latter half of the 20th century is responsible, actually, for the ecumenical adoption of the Feast of Christ the King or the Reign of God, which is the closest liturgical analog in many ways to the proposed Feast of Creation. Teresa Berger and I have a debate about this, but I think I'm right. Closest liturgical analog, it turns out, will hold a little air. The Feast of Christ the King was added to the calendar in 1925. It was closely connected to Pius XI's encyclical on the peace of Christ in the kingdom of Christ, which sounds very useful right now. Just as the Feast of Creation was partly popularized as a response to Francis's Laudato Si. Pope XI's encyclical responded to the post-World War I political landscape of Europe, class warfare, political polarization, and nationalist fervor. Quote, "Nor has this illusory peace," namely following the war, "written only on paper, served as yet to reawaken similar noble sentiments in the souls of men. On the contrary, there has been born a spirit of violence and of hatred, which, because it has been indulged in for so long, has become almost second nature in many men." This feast was also connected to the Council of Nicaea. Quote, "Since this Jubilee year marks the 16th century of the Council of Nicaea, 16th centenary, of the Council of Nicaea, we commanded that event, the Feast of Christ the King, to be celebrated, closing this holy year with the insertion into the sacred liturgy of a special feast of the kingship of our Lord Jesus Christ." The feast was then moved to the Sunday before Advent in the reformation of the liturgical calendar following Vatican II, so it is now the last Sunday at the end of the liturgical year, in keeping with a sort of newfound eschatological emphasis at that time. Then this lectionary reform was done in ecumenical collaboration with liturgical and biblical scholars from many different churches, and its substance was then adopted into the ecumenical common lectionaries, which reflected most of the scriptures, seasons, and feasts, including this one. And as a result, this title for Christ and its feast were received into a number of Protestant contexts. Besides the connection with an encyclical, a Nicene centenary, a major issue of global concern, and ecumenical collaboration, there is another similarity between the proposed Feast of Creation and the Feast of Christ the King. Each enhances an existing theme latent in the entire liturgical year, rather than attending to a specific event, a historical event in Christ's earthly life. The theological function of these kinds of feasts, or idea feasts they're sometimes called, which also include Corpus Christi, Trinity Sunday, and the Sacred Heart, is to improve the visibility of a mystery that might otherwise fade into the background of the liturgical year. We see that, I think, there's no Sunday in our church year that creation disappears, and yet its relevance can fade for us. So the contemporary historical era has brought into sharp relief the need for this feast against the background of the separation between humanity and the rest of the created order in the modern period in the global north, and the catastrophic impact of that separation on the natural world. But Christ the King is limited to the Western churches, and it is hard to envision the Orthodox adopting a new feast in conjunction with the West, again, at this present moment. Thus, Heinrich Bedford Strom remarked at the 2025 meeting, quote, "If the Assisi process continues to develop and reach its goal it might become a landmark in the history of Christianity. Looking back into the second millennium, there seems to be only one precedent, the Feast of the Transfiguration, which was originally celebrated in the East and then adopted in the West in 1456. The present year of the 1700th anniversary of the Council of Nicaea is an optimal occasion to give a decisive push to this process, envisioning a feast in the church year that would be a wonderful expression of the Trinitarian essence that unites us as churches to this day. An ecumenical motivation, and yet at the same time, every church has to follow its own logic in determining whether to implement the Feast of Creation or not, and what it means and how. That orthodox approach is in some ways the simplest, in that the feast has changed its emphasis in response to contemporary problems, but that was done by a central authority several decades ago. No one really remembers that. There's a lot of flexibility in exactly how to implement it. In March 2020, so on the other hand, in March 2024, we had mainline bodies, Orthodox and Catholics in Assisi, and the seminar proposed, quote, elevating the Feast of Creation from its current World Day of Prayer status to become a liturgical feast. For the mainline bodies that were represented, this was received with a lot of energy. On one hand, many congregations in these communions had already been celebrating the season of creation out of concern for the natural world. On the other hand, the 1700th anniversary of Nicaea and the major progress in ecumenical dialogue among creedal churches since the 1600th anniversary was very important. And the seminar pointed out, in addition, that almost all the other major moments in the Creed have proper commemorations in the liturgical year, except creation, which is referenced in each one of the sections of the Creed: the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, Christ, through whom all things are made, and the Holy Spirit, the giver of life. In my own Roman Catholic communion, things were much more difficult, necessitating several follow-up conversations. A universal feast for us is quite different than a World Day of Prayer, and it's not obvious that the one can be elevated into the other. We have lots of days of prayer, petitions, celebrations of various needs, but a universal feast, this is just like a small snippet of the USCCB's calendar of days of prayer. And one of the arguments that we heard over and over again in Assisi is like, are you going to make Grandparents' Day a feast next? So that's a literal quotation. Some of you were there, you can confirm. We have, where am I? A universal feast, on the other hand, one binding on the global Catholic Church since Vatican II, has meant either a feast of the Lord or a feast of one of the saints. Creation isn't the Lord, and it's not one of the saints. As I said, with Christ the King, we have some idea feasts. You can see that the title Christ the King gave us some wiggle room to declare it a feast of the Lord, even though it's not a historical celebration of an aspect of his life, but here we are. While there's great enthusiasm for this feast in bishops' conferences in the global south, in the global north, eco-theology is perceived by some as divisive and political. This is one of the reasons why the conversation arose about how Creation Day is not a Christian Earth Day, which is a little unfortunate because Christian Earth Day would be a nice message for a lot of churches to send. That would make a lot of sense for a lot of people. We are the problem. Instead, it is a celebration of the mystery of God's creation of heaven and earth. More on that in a little while. The Feast of the Lord Challenge is actually really interesting for thinking better about our theology of the liturgical year. So here's one instance where, as a Roman Catholic theologian that has inherited this distinction, I have found it really helpful to have that distinction challenged ecumenically. The distinction between Feasts of the Lord and Feasts of Saints emerged for a reason. It was part of the liturgical reforms around Vatican II as a way of prioritizing feasts about Jesus over those that celebrate individual saints. Maybe this quick dichotomy that we established at Vatican II is really always an oversimplification, as my colleague Joris Geldhoff suggested in our Roman Catholic deliberations. After all, creation, that is, God's activity in creating the universe out of love, fits seamlessly into an understanding of the liturgical year as the proclamation of God's deeds of salvation. Moreover, the liturgical year has always responded to the Church's emerging discernment of a central doctrine that seemed to need more attention, as Rowan Williams pointed out in a parallel with the emergence of Corpus Christi. Finally, the various feasts do not speak independently, but resonate with one another to create one sacramental understanding of the world. As Geldhoff put it, quote, "The thread of a feast of creation can be safely woven into the tapestry of the liturgical year. Given the time in which we live and the unique ecumenical opportunities in the symbolic year 2025, which is now past, it would constitute a meaningful addition to the liturgy. More than that, however, the feast would help us understand other aspects and dimensions of liturgical feasts and seasons, and thereby create ample chances for deepening the sensitivity for the saving presence of God's mystery in world and history. Liturgical piety will be enhanced by the assertion of a feast of creation, not least because sacramentality as expressive of being's porosity will be naturally fostered." More on that in a little bit. Of course, the authority question would be simple for Catholics if the Pope would just say, "We're adding this feast to the universal calendar," which he could do. Pope Francis's, and that it actually requires some explanation as to why Pope Francis didn't do it, because his Laudato Si was, of course, the inspiration for a global network of Catholics committed to combating climate change that actually were instigating this Feast of Creation project. Nonetheless, Francis did not mandate the feast, but sought instead synodal feedback from bishops' conferences. In July 2025, in response to that feedback perhaps, a Mass for the Care of Creation, which is a Mass for various needs and occasions, kind of akin to our days of prayer, but it's like in the book and you can use it at most times of the year. It was released, and it was used by a number of Catholic churches on September 1st, especially in the Global South, where the feast day has been enthusiastically adopted by several regions. In May 2025, another ecumenical conference was held that included for the first time many free church representatives. The challenge for the free churches is obviously quite different, and in fact there's a wide spread of different challenges among them. For some of these churches, the members of their communities are deeply suspicious of environmentalism, and so this becomes a kind of wedge way of talking about its importance. And for others, and for them, the central body has no authority, so that's another challenge. For others, they really don't have a liturgical year, and so considering whether to adopt the Feast of Creation is really quite a novelty. So for example, Major Heather Poxon of the Salvation Army simultaneously, sorry, I skipped a slide, went too fast, simultaneously expressed her support and the ecumenical gap when she said, quote, "Thank you for inviting a very non-liturgical, non-lectionary following church to a very liturgical conference." It was such a great moment, everybody. It was a great moment. As the worldwide church, we need to learn to sing a new song. I will be taking this back to our congregations and will work to make sure that we embrace an annual celebration of Creation Day. As we discuss the feast across these several conferences, the different challenges and perspectives experienced by each communion influenced one another, and shared trust also developed. As a result, the theological picture of the feast is rich and multifaceted, summarized under these 4 points. 1, the feast's core, God's act of creation. 2, creation as a Christological mystery. 3, creation as a Trinitarian mystery. And 4, creation as a sacramental and covenanted gift. The first is a clarification that the creation of Creation Day is a celebration of the Creator God and God's act. It may include lament about the state of anthropogenic ecological devastation and an increased awareness of the need to care for creation, but its fundamental orientation is thanksgiving toward God. We can see here the need to set aside the Feast of Creation from Earth Day, although, as I said, to relate it to Earth Day would really be really helpful in a lot of contexts. The second dimension on creation as a Christological mystery unfolds the fact that the same incarnate Word of the Gospels is also the Word through whom all things were made at the beginning. The Christological dimension is important for highlighting the cosmic mystery and mission of Christ, who is the creating and sustaining Word for all things. In our highly anthropocentric culture in the global north, it is very easy to be focused on, the restoration of human beings, and individuals at that, instead of on the restoration of all God's creatures. Third, Christianity, I see the way that this got adapted. I'm sorry about this. Didn't understand how my software was going to work here. The third piece, the Trinitarian mystery, reminds us that Christianity, while it's not Christocentric, it's not Christomonic, and we need to remember how all three persons are involved in creation, as is expressed even in the Creed. I wonder whether this framework could promote actually fuller ecumenical reflection on the Trinity that was a little bit less abstract. Commemorating God's act of creation, number 4, our fourth point, reveals also how the created cosmos that flows from it is sacramental. And what we mean by that is that our experience of the created order reveals the Creator, that it's filled with God's presence, and that it provides a foundation out of which our liturgical experiences can be built. So the sacramentality of creation is actually the foundation of the sacramentality of our liturgy. It also reminds us of the way that creation is covenanted with God, beloved by God, and a gift for us to cherish, not a possession for us to use, by which then we get out of this larger theological framework to the notion that human misuse of creation is a kind of desecration of God's work. So, across these traditions, it is no surprise that a variety of ways of speaking about the feast makes sense. For Catholics, given that we have a special category right now for Feasts of the Lord, and no one else wants to wait longer than is necessary for us to work out our liturgical theology, a Christological title like the Feast of the Creation in Christ or the Feast of the Mystery of Creation in Christ helps us integrate the feast into our categories. But long term, maybe we should challenge those categories, finding that the celebration of salvation history over the liturgical year is larger than the commemoration of specific events from Christ's life. For other traditions, a clearer connection with the Nicene Creed is a better fit. And for some traditions, like the Salvation Army, Creation Day is best. In the Orthodox Church, in fact, the informal designation Feast of Creation or Creation Day is used widely, but the official title is still the Feast of Indiction, which is a, Byzantine imperial, secular day. So, okay, what does the Feast of Creation have to offer us? Liturgically and pastorally. Liturgically, the process of developing the Feast of Creation has already helped us see more clearly what is unfolded in the liturgical year, not individual feasts that commemorate days of Christ's life or saints, but the one mystery of God's love that envelops us, that is revealed to us once and for all in Christ, and also demands our ongoing recognition towards its eschatological completion. As a result of this, it encourages us to see how our celebration of each liturgical feast and season also builds up our experience of the liturgical year and the mystery of God as a whole. Pastorally, it has encouraged Christians to see care for creation as connected to their Christian faith, and Christians in the global north to see more clearly the impact of climate change and related anthropogenic developments on their siblings in the global south. Theologically, I also think it's been important. Paradoxically, in these discussions, we initially moved away from the idea of like creation in itself as needing care and solicitude towards the mystery of God's work, which permitted a return to creatures as revelatory and sacramental, which I think is actually helpful in that actual sustainability practices are like you can't do all of them and you need to do some of them and you have to choose between them. And so being able to put them in a broader theological framework is actually kind of helpful. Ecumenically, which I'm going to get to last because as you know, it is the thing I care about the most. I also have seen something really new happening in these discussions at Assisi. I actually had the privilege of facilitating and reporting on the large group discussion that developed this sort of threefold options in the first place. And I learned something new about the state of the ecumenical movement today. Historically, in the past, in our doctrinal discussions, we often issue consensus statements and then have our communities come back to us and tell us they don't believe the consensus statements because we can't possibly agree with one another that much. This is in part because without a shared lived context for understanding these statements and the participation in dialogue together about the statements, ambiguity always remains, and ambiguity will almost always be interpreted in line with our old theology textbooks that are putting each other's down rather than our loving relationships with one another today. What was fascinating to me about the discussions that determined the flexibility of names for the feast then was how neatly it inverted this common accusation about ecumenical dialogue. Over the 2 years of discussions, it became evident that these 4 theological core tenets that I described above were shared by participants from very different ecclesial contexts. The theological consensus about creation and its relationship to the Nicene faith was deep and thick, even among churches that are not formally creedal churches. What was different was the cultural context, the besetting questions, not only in different communions, but also in different parts of the world. In the conversations that we were able to have at the end of the May 2025 meeting, we had enough trust in that robust consensus to free one another to address their concerns differently in various contexts. That to me suggests a new stage and a new thing that is happening in the liturgical movement surrounding our liturgical work together. Thank you. A postscript. I saw people taking pictures of the slides. All the slides you liked were the Assisi slides, so I'll have Jim circulate those.
Sure. Kim, thank you so much for the wisdom and the insight and the experience that you bring to us today. Thank you. You've got about a 15-minute break, and then workshops begin. Rachel and Betsy and I will be out in the hallway if you need direction to your workshop locations. Continue to have a blessed day.